Welcome back to Revenge Room. Today's story is called Get Out of Here, my daughter-in-law shouted during dinner. So I left, but not alone. They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when your own daughter-in-law poisons that blood, turns your son against you, and then has the audacity to throw you out of a dinner table you helped build? 3 words. That's all it took to shatter 43 years of fatherhood. Get out of here, she said it in front of everyone. My son sat there silent, staring at his plate like a coward. Not a single word in my defense. I'd given that boy everything, my sweat, my savings, my entire life, and he let his wife humiliate me like I was a stranger begging for scraps. But here's what she didn't know. My wife saw this coming years before she passed. She knew exactly what kind of woman had entered our family. And from beyond the grave, she had prepared something that would make my daughter-in-law regret every single word she ever spoke to me. So yes, I left that night. But I didn't leave empty-handed. I took something with me, something she thought she already owned. And when she finally realized what was gone, what she would never get back, she didn't just cry. She screamed, "If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you, you don't. Stay with me until the very end, because the ending will leave you cheering. This is my story. My name is Leonard Ashford. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 4 decades building bridges across 3 states. I have been a widower for 18 months now, ever since my beloved wife Margaret lost her battle with cancer. I thought the hardest days of my life were behind me. I was wrong. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon. My son Noah called, his voice strangely formal, asking if I could join him and his wife Kara for dinner that Friday. A family gathering, he said. Nothing special, just the 3 of us catching up. I should have known better. In 8 years of marriage to Kara, nothing was ever just catching up. But I wanted to believe. I wanted to hold on to the hope that somewhere inside my son, the boy I raised, still existed. So I ironed my best shirt, picked up a bottle of wine, and drove 40 minutes to their house with a heart full of foolish optimism. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt it, that cold undercurrent that runs beneath polite smiles and empty words. Kara greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that never quite touched my skin. Noah shook my hand like I was a business acquaintance rather than the man who taught him to ride a bicycle. The dining room was immaculate. Candles lit the table set with their finest china. It looked warm and inviting. It felt like a courtroom. Dinner began with small talk, the weather, the neighbors, a new restaurant downtown. But Kara had a way of steering every conversation back to me, and never in a kind direction. She asked if I was remembering to take my medications. She wondered aloud if I found it difficult living alone in that big house. She mentioned a friend whose father had recently moved into a lovely retirement community, her tone suggesting it was something I should consider. Each comment was wrapped in concern, but underneath I heard the message clearly. You are old, you are declining, you are becoming a burden. Noah said nothing. He sat across from me, pushing food around his plate, his eyes never meeting mine. My son, who once ran to me with every scraped knee and broken toy, now could not even look at me while his wife dissected my dignity piece by piece. I wanted to reach across the table and shake him. I wanted to ask what happened to the boy who used to say I was his hero. But I stayed silent. I had learned that silence was the only armor I had left in this house. The real purpose of the evening revealed itself between the main course and dessert. Kara excused herself briefly and returned with a manila folder. She slid it across the table toward me with a smile that never reached her eyes. Just some paperwork, she explained, for convenience, to make things easier for everyone. I opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. My chest tightened. It was a financial power of attorney granting Kara full control over my bank accounts, my investments, my savings. Everything Margaret and I had built over 50 years of marriage handed over to a woman who looked at me like I was already gone. I closed the folder gently and pushed it back toward her. I told her I appreciated the thought, but I was not ready to sign anything like this. I said it calmly, respectfully, the way I had spoken to difficult contractors and demanding clients throughout my career. But Kara was not a contractor. She was not interested in negotiation. Her face changed. The mask she wore so carefully cracked right down the middle. She stood up from her chair, her napkin falling to the floor, and pointed toward the front door. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Get out of here. You are not welcome in this family anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. I looked at Noah, waiting for him to say something, anything. He stared at his plate. His silence was louder than her screaming. I rose slowly from my chair. My knees ached, but I refused to let it show. As I turned to leave, my eyes caught the photograph on the wall, Margaret smiling at me from our 30th anniversary. I could almost hear her voice in my mind, soft and knowing. "You always knew what she was, did you not?" I looked back at Kara, at her triumphant sneer at Noah's bowed head. And for the first time that evening, I smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a defeated smile, a calm, steady smile that made Kara's expression flicker with confusion. "I will leave," I said quietly. "But I will not be leaving alone." I walked out of that house with my head held high, but my heart felt like it was bleeding inside my chest. The night air was cold against my face as I made my way to my car. I didn't look back. I could feel Kara's eyes on me through the window, watching, waiting to see if I would crumble. I would not give her that satisfaction. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the house where my son had become a stranger. Inside that dining room, Kara stood at the window, watching my taillights disappear into the darkness. My words echoed in her mind like a stone thrown into still water, spreading ripples she could not quite understand. "I will not be leaving alone." What did that mean? She turned the phrase over and over, searching for a threat, a hidden meaning, anything that would explain the unsettling calm in my voice. I was supposed to be broken. I was supposed to leave in shame, defeated, ready to crawl back and sign whatever she put in front of me. Instead, I had smiled. That smile bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Noah lingered at the dining table, his fingers tracing the edge of his untouched dessert plate. The silence between them grew heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Should we apologize to him? The question hung in the air like a fragile thing waiting to be crushed. Kara turned from the window, her expression hardening into something cold and dismissive. "Apologize for what? He has nothing. Noah, we have everything. He is just a stubborn old man who does not understand that his time is over. He will come around. They always do." Noah nodded slowly, but something flickered behind his eyes. A shadow of doubt, a whisper of the son he used to be. He said nothing more, and Kara returned to clearing the dishes, already planning her next move. She was certain of her victory. She had no idea how wrong she was. I drove through the empty streets with the radio off and the windows up. The town looked different at night, quieter, lonelier. Street lamps cast pools of orange light on the pavement, and the houses I passed glowed with the warm light of families gathered inside. I wondered how many of those families held secrets like mine. How many fathers sat at dinner tables where they were no longer welcome. How many sons had forgotten the hands that raised them. The thoughts pressed down on me like a weight I could not shake. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house loomed before me in the darkness. Margaret and I had bought this place 42 years ago, back when the neighborhood was still young and our dreams were still bright. We had raised Noah in these rooms. We had celebrated anniversaries, weathered storms, buried our parents, and grown old together within these walls. Now the windows were dark, and the only person waiting inside was the ghost of everything I had lost. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the silence. The air smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Margaret used to place in every closet. I had not had the heart to remove them. I walked through the living room without turning on the lights, guided by memory and habit, until I reached the small study at the back of the house. This had been Margaret's sanctuary. Her books still lined the shelves. Her reading glasses still sat on the side table. Her presence still lingered in every corner, as if she had only stepped out for a moment and would return any second. I lowered myself into the old armchair across from her desk and sat there in the darkness, staring at her portrait on the wall. She smiled back at me with those warm eyes that had seen me through every triumph and failure of my life. I missed her so much that it felt like a physical ache, a hollowness in my chest that nothing could fill. I spoke to her sometimes when the loneliness became too heavy. Tonight, I had no words. I simply sat and let the silence wrap around me like a cold blanket. My eyes drifted to her desk, to the small drawer on the right side that I had never opened. Margaret had kept it locked for as long as I could remember. When I asked her about it once years ago, she had simply smiled and said it held things for a rainy day. After she passed, I could not bring myself to open it. The drawer felt like the last sealed chamber of her heart, the final secret between us, and I was afraid that opening it would mean admitting she was truly gone. So I left it locked month after month, pretending that someday she would come back and open it herself. But tonight felt different. Tonight something had shifted inside me. Kara's words still rang in my ears. You are not welcome in this family anymore. My own son had sat there and let it happen. Everything I thought I knew about my life had been stripped away in a single evening. I was 70 years old, cast out by the only family I had left. If there was ever a rainy day, this was it. I rose from the chair and walked to Margaret's jewelry box on the dresser. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the lid. Inside, beneath her pearls and the earrings I had given her on our 25th anniversary, I found a small brass key. I held it in my palm for a long moment, feeling its weight, its significance. Then I carried it to the desk and knelt before the locked drawer. The key slid in smoothly. The lock turned with a soft click. I pulled the drawer open and found a single envelope inside, yellowed slightly with age. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the handwriting on the front. It was Margaret's, elegant and familiar, written in the blue ink she always preferred. The words she had written made my heart stop. Open this when you need strength. I prepared everything. My hands would not stop shaking. I stared at those words written in Margaret's familiar script, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Open this when you need strength. I prepared everything. How had she known? How could she have possibly known that this night would come, that I would find myself cast out and alone, desperately needing something to hold on to? The envelope felt impossibly light in my hands, yet it carried the weight of everything I had lost and everything I still did not understand. I carried the envelope to the armchair and sat down heavily. The house was silent around me, but my heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I turned the envelope over and saw that it was sealed with a small piece of tape, yellowed with age. On the back, Margaret had written a date. It was 6 months before she passed away. 6 months before the cancer finally took her from me. She had written this letter knowing she was dying, knowing she would not be here to protect me herself. The realization hit me like a wave, and I had to close my eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. I slid my finger beneath the seal and opened the envelope carefully, as if it were made of glass. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly in thirds. I unfolded it with trembling fingers and began to read. My dearest Leonard, the letter began. If you are reading this, then the day I feared has finally arrived. I'm so sorry I am not there beside you. I'm so sorry you had to face whatever brought you to this drawer alone. But I need you to know that even though I am gone, I have not left you unprotected. I have been preparing for this moment for 3 years, ever since I first saw what Kara truly is. I had to stop reading. The tears I had been holding back spilled down my cheeks, and I pressed the letter against my chest as if I could somehow press it against my heart. Margaret's voice was so clear in these words, so alive, that for a moment I could almost believe she was sitting beside me, her hand on mine, telling me everything would be all right. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. I've watched Kara carefully since the day Noah brought her home. At first I wanted to believe she was simply ambitious, perhaps a little cold, but not dangerous. I was wrong. Over the years I have seen her isolate Noah from his friends, from his values, from us. I have heard her speak about you when she thought I was not listening. She sees you as an obstacle, Leonard. She sees our family's savings as her inheritance, and she has been waiting for me to die so she could take control. I could not stop her while I was alive without destroying our son's marriage and breaking your heart. But I could prepare. The letter instructed me to contact Douglas Merritt first thing in the morning. Douglas had been our family attorney for over 30 years, a quiet and principled man who had helped us with everything from buying our first house to drafting our wills. Margaret explained that she had visited Douglas in secret during the final months of her life. Together, they had created something called a living trust with an elder protection clause. I had never heard of such a thing, but Margaret explained it clearly in her letter. The trust held all of our assets, everything we had built together over 50 years of marriage. I was the primary beneficiary for as long as I lived, with full control over everything. After my death, Noah was supposed to inherit, but only under one condition. He had to demonstrate that he had treated me with dignity and respect throughout my remaining years. If there was documented evidence of mistreatment, verbal abuse, financial exploitation, or any attempt to isolate me from my home or my autonomy, the trustee had the power to redirect every penny to a charitable foundation in Margaret's name. Noah and Kara would receive nothing. I read that paragraph 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Margaret had built a fortress around me from beyond the grave. She had anticipated exactly what Kara would try to do, and she had made sure that if it ever happened, there would be consequences. The woman who had loved me for 48 years had spent her final months not grieving for herself, but protecting me from the storm she knew was coming. The letter continued with words that broke me completely. I know you, my love. I know you would rather suffer in silence than cause conflict. I know you would let them take everything rather than fight back, because fighting back might mean losing Noah forever. But Leonard, you deserve to be treated with dignity. You deserve to spend your final years in peace, not in fear. I could not bear the thought of leaving you defenseless. So I did what I could. I gave you a shield. Please use it. I wept then. I wept like I had not wept since the day she died. Great heaving sobs that shook my entire body and echoed through the empty house. My wife, my Margaret, had loved me so completely that even death could not stop her from wrapping her arms around me. I clutched the letter to my chest and let the grief and gratitude pour out of me until I had nothing left. When the tears finally subsided, I read the final paragraph. There is one more thing, Leonard. I knew that someday Kara would show her true face, and when that day came, you would need more than legal documents. You would need proof. Check the old radio in the study, the one that belonged to my father. I knew they would reveal themselves eventually. I made sure someone would be listening. I looked up at the antique radio sitting on the shelf across the room. It had belonged to Margaret's father, a treasured heirloom she had kept polished and displayed for decades. I rose from the chair on unsteady legs and crossed the room. My fingers found the small panel on the back of the radio, the one that had always been slightly loose. I pulled it open and found something that made my breath catch in my throat. A small recording device no bigger than a pack of cards was tucked inside the hollow cabinet. Beside it was a notebook filled with dates and timestamps, dozens of recordings spanning over 2 years, capturing every conversation that had taken place in this house since Margaret first began to suspect what Kara was planning. I sat down at Margaret's desk with the recording device in one hand and the notebook in the other. The weight of what I held felt immense, not in pounds, but in meaning. My wife had spent the final years of her life building something I never knew. Existed a silent archive of truth hidden inside an antique radio. Before I pressed play on any of those recordings, I needed to understand how we had arrived at this moment. I needed to remember who we were, who I was before Kara ever entered our lives. I was not born into wealth or privilege. My father worked in a lumber mill, and my mother took in laundry to help make ends meet. We lived in a small house with thin walls and a leaky roof, but we had love and we had pride. My parents taught me that a man's worth was measured not by what he owned, but by what he built with his own 2 hands. I took that lesson to heart. I studied engineering at a state college, working nights at a warehouse to pay my tuition. When I graduated, I took a job with a construction firm and never looked back. Over the next 4 decades, I helped design and build bridges across 3 states. Some of them still stand today, carrying thousands of cars every day, connecting communities that were once separated by rivers and valleys. Every time I drive past one of those bridges, I feel a quiet pride that no amount of money could ever buy. Margaret and I met at a church picnic when we were both 22 years old. She was working as a secretary at an insurance company, saving money to take night classes in criminal justice. There was something about her that caught my attention immediately, a sharpness in her eyes, a wit in her conversation that told me she was no ordinary woman. We married a year later in a small ceremony with only our families present. We could not afford a honeymoon, so we spent our first week as husband and wife painting the tiny apartment we had rented together. Those were some of the happiest days of my life. Margaret eventually became a claims investigator for her insurance company, a position she held for over 20 years. Her job was to examine suspicious claims, to interview witnesses, to gather evidence that would either validate or expose the people who filed reports. She was extraordinary at it. She had an instinct for deception, a way of noticing the small details that others overlooked. She could listen to someone tell a story and know within minutes whether they were telling the truth. I used to joke that she could have been a detective in another life. She would smile and say that she preferred catching liars in boardrooms rather than back alleys. The point is, Margaret knew how to build a case. She knew how to document patterns of behavior, how to collect proof, how to wait patiently until she had everything she needed to expose the truth. I never imagined she would one day use those skills to protect me. We raised Noah in a modest home, even though we could have afforded something grander. We drove reliable cars, took simple vacations, and put money away for the future. By the time I retired, we had accumulated more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of our lives. But we never flaunted it. We never saw wealth as something to display. It was security, nothing more. A cushion against the uncertainties of old age. We planned to leave everything to Noah when we were gone, trusting that he would use it wisely and remember the values we had tried to instill in him. Then Kara arrived. I still remember the day Noah brought her home to meet us 8 years ago. She was charming, polished, and beautiful in a way that seemed almost practiced. She laughed at all the right moments, complimented Margaret's cooking, and told me how much she admired men who worked with their hands. But Margaret saw something I missed. That night, after Noah and Kara had left, my wife sat quietly at the kitchen table for a long time. When I asked her what was wrong, she looked at me with troubled eyes and said something I would never forget. "Give her a chance, Leonard. But I'm going to prepare for the worst." I asked her what she meant, but she only shook her head and changed the subject. I didn't press her. I trusted her instincts, but I also wanted to believe the best about the woman my son loved. For 8 years, I chose silence. I watched Kara slowly reshape Noah into someone I barely recognized. I noticed how she discouraged him from visiting us, how she controlled their finances, how she spoke to me with thinly veiled contempt whenever Margaret was not in the room. I told myself it was not my place to interfere. I told myself that every marriage had its difficulties and that Noah needed to find his own way. I swallowed my concerns and smiled through countless awkward dinners because I believed that keeping the peace was more important than speaking the truth. But Kara's words at that dinner table, "Get out of here, you are not welcome in this family anymore," had crossed a line I could not ignore. Some insults can be forgiven. Some wounds can heal. But being cast out of your own son's life by a woman who saw you as nothing more than an obstacle to her inheritance was something I could not simply accept. I looked down at the recording device in my hands. Margaret had known this day would come. She had prepared for it with the same meticulous care she brought to every investigation in her career. I found the first recording in the notebook dated 14 months ago and pressed play. Kara's voice filled the room, sharp and clear, captured without her knowledge during a conversation in this very house. She was talking to Noah, her tone dripping with impatience. "Your father is worth more dead than alive to us. The sooner he is out of the picture, the sooner we can take control of everything. Do you understand?" Noah's response was mumbled, inaudible, but Kara's words needed no clarification. My hands began to shake, but not from weakness, not from age, not from fear. They shook from something I had not felt in years. A fire that I thought had gone cold was roaring back to life inside my chest. I looked at Margaret's portrait on the wall, at her knowing smile, at the love that still radiated from her eyes, even in a photograph. "Margaret," I whispered into the empty room, "you gave me the sword. Now I will use it." While I sat in that quiet study holding the evidence of my wife's foresight, Kara was across town, savoring what she believed was her final victory. If I could have seen inside her mind that night, I would have witnessed a woman so consumed by her own arrogance that she never noticed the ground crumbling beneath her feet. I learned later through the recordings and through what Douglas uncovered exactly how Kara spent those hours after I left her house. The picture it painted was one of calculated cruelty dressed in designer clothes. Kara stood at her kitchen counter that night, sipping a glass of expensive wine, replaying the evening's events with quiet satisfaction. In her mind, everything had gone exactly as planned. The old man had been humiliated. He had been shown his place. He had been reminded that he no longer mattered in this family. She expected me to spend a few weeks sulking in that empty house, growing lonelier and more desperate with each passing day, until I eventually came crawling back, ready to sign whatever she put in front of me. That was how she saw me. A feeble old fool who would trade his dignity for a seat at the dinner table. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Noah sat in the living room, staring at the television without really watching it. He had barely spoken since I left. Kara noticed his silence and felt a flicker of irritation. She walked over and stood in front of him, blocking his view of the screen. He looked up at her with eyes that held something she had not seen in years. Uncertainty. She asked him what was wrong, and he mumbled something about maybe having been too harsh. Maybe they should call and apologize. Kara's response was immediate and dismissive. "Apologize for what? He has nothing. We have everything. Your father is a relic, Noah, a stubborn old man who refuses to accept that his time is over. He will come around. They always do. Noah nodded slowly and returned his gaze to the television. Kara smiled to herself. She had trained him well over the years. He no longer questioned her decisions. He no longer challenged her authority. Their marriage was not a partnership. It was a kingdom, and she was the only one who wore the crown. Later that night, after Noah had gone to bed, Kara made a phone call. She retreated to the privacy of her home office and dialed a number she knew by heart. The voice that answered was older, sharper, and carried the same cold confidence that Kara herself had perfected over the years. It was her mother. Kara spoke to her the way a student speaks to a mentor reporting progress on a long-term project. "Everything is going according to plan, Mother. The old man refused to sign tonight, but it does not matter. He is alone now. No wife, no friends, just that empty house and his precious memories. He will break eventually, or he will become too confused to stop us. Either way, we win." Her mother's response was approving. "Patience, dear. These things take time. Your grandmother waited 3 years before she got everything from your grandfather. The key is to never let them see you coming until it is too late." Kara promised to keep her updated and ended the call with a smile. She had learned from the best. What I did not know at the time, but discovered through Margaret's recordings and Douglas's investigation, was that Kara had already taken steps to ensure her victory. 3 months before that disastrous dinner, I had caught a severe case of the flu. For 2 weeks, I was bedridden, weak, and foggy from the medications the doctor had prescribed. During that time, Kara made several visits to check on me. I remember thinking how kind it was of her, how perhaps I had misjudged her all along. She brought me soup. She tidied up the kitchen. She sat by my bedside and talked to me in a soft, concerned voice. And one afternoon, when I was barely lucid from fever and medication, she slid a stack of papers onto my lap and asked me to sign them. "Just some insurance documents," she explained. "Routine paperwork that needed my signature for the records." I was too weak and too trusting to read them carefully. I signed where she pointed and handed them back. Grateful that someone was taking care of the details I could not manage myself. Those documents were not insurance paperwork. They were a durable power of attorney, granting Kara full legal authority over my financial affairs. With my signature on those pages, she believed she had the key to everything Margaret and I had built. She could access my accounts. She could make decisions about my assets. She could, if she wanted, begin transferring wealth into her own name without my knowledge or consent. It was a masterful piece of manipulation executed with the precision of someone who had done this before. But Kara made one critical mistake. In her arrogance, she never considered that someone might be watching. She never imagined that Margaret, even in death, might still be protecting me. And she certainly never suspected that among the files Margaret had carefully organized before her passing was a copy of that same power of attorney document. Margaret had obtained it through Douglas, who had been quietly monitoring all legal filings related to our family's affairs. When I finally examined that document weeks later, sitting across from Douglas in his office, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The signature on the page was not mine. It was close a reasonable imitation, but the loops were wrong, the pressure was inconsistent, and the angle of the letters tilted in a direction my hand had never naturally moved. Kara had not just deceived me into signing a document I did not understand. She had forged my signature entirely, creating a fraudulent legal instrument that gave her power she had never legitimately obtained. In her mind, she had already won. In reality, she had just handed me the evidence I needed to destroy her. The next morning, I drove to Douglas Merritt's law office on the east side of town. It was a modest building tucked between a bakery and a hardware store, the kind of place you might walk past 100 times without noticing. Douglas had never cared for fancy addresses or prestigious suites. He believed that good legal work spoke for itself and that clients who needed expensive decor to feel confident were probably hiring the wrong attorney. Margaret and I had trusted him with our most important documents for over 30 years, and he had never given us reason to doubt that trust. I parked on the street and sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts. In my briefcase, I carried Margaret's letter, the recording device, and the copy of the power of attorney that bore a signature I had never written. These items felt like weapons, dangerous and powerful, and I was not entirely sure I was ready to use them. But then I remembered Kara's voice on that recording. "Your father is worth more dead than alive to us." I remembered my son's silence at the dinner table, his eyes fixed on his plate while his wife ordered me out of their home. I remembered Margaret's words in her letter. "You deserve to be treated with dignity." I stepped out of the car and walked toward the office door. Douglas greeted me in the small reception area with a look of surprise that quickly softened into concern. We had not spoken since Margaret's funeral 18 months ago. He had attended the service, sat quietly in the back row, and shaken my hand afterward with the kind of solemn respect that required no words. Now he ushered me into his private office, closed the door, and gestured for me to sit in the worn leather chair across from his desk. His eyes moved to the briefcase in my hands, and I could see him already calculating what might have brought me here after so long. I told him everything. I told him about the dinner, about Kara's words, about Noah's silence. I told him about finding Margaret's letter and the recording device hidden in the old radio. I showed him the power of attorney document and watched his face change as he examined it. He held the paper up to the light, studied the signature for a long moment, then set it down on his desk with a heaviness that told me he had reached a conclusion he did not want to share. "Leonard," he said quietly, "I have known your signature for 40 years. I've seen it on contracts, deeds, wills, and countless other documents. This is not your handwriting. The loops are wrong. The pressure is inconsistent. The slant is off by nearly 15 degrees. This signature is a forgery, and forgery on a legal document of this nature is a felony under Vermont law." The word felony hung in the air between us. I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone with Douglas's expertise made it real in a way I had not fully prepared for. Kara had not just manipulated me, she had committed a crime. A serious crime that could send her to prison if prosecuted. Douglas opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a thick folder I recognized immediately. It bore Margaret's name on the label, and I realized with a start that my wife had been working with him far more extensively than I had ever known. He explained that Margaret had come to him 3 years ago, shortly after she first began to suspect what Kara was capable of. Together, they had created a comprehensive legal structure designed to protect me and to ensure that our assets could never be stolen by someone who saw our family as nothing more than a source of wealth to exploit. The centerpiece of this structure was a living trust that held everything Margaret and I had accumulated over 50 years of marriage. I was the primary beneficiary for as long as I lived, with full control over all assets and complete authority to make decisions about my own care and finances. After my death, Noah was designated as the secondary beneficiary, but his inheritance came with conditions. He could only receive his share if he demonstrated respectful and loving treatment of his father during my remaining years. The trust document spelled out specific criteria, regular visits, inclusion in family decisions, and most importantly, protection from any form of abuse or exploitation. But the most powerful provision was something Douglas called the Elder Protection Clause. If documented evidence showed that I had been subjected to verbal abuse, financial exploitation, isolation from family or community, or any attempt to deprive me of my autonomy or dignity, the trustee had the authority to redirect every penny in the trust to a charitable foundation established in Margaret's name. Noah and Kara would receive nothing. Not a single dollar of the wealth they had been counting on would ever reach their hands. I asked Douglas about the recordings Margaret had made. Could they actually be used as evidence, or were they obtained illegally? Douglas explained that Vermont was what lawyers called a one-party consent state. This meant that as long as one person involved in a conversation consented to being recorded, the recording was legal and admissible in court. Margaret had been present during many of the conversations she captured, and even for those where she was not physically in the room, she had documented everything in a way that would hold up under legal scrutiny. My wife had thought of everything. Douglas spread the documents across his desk and looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. It was a mixture of admiration and sorrow, the look of a man who respected what Margaret had built but understood the devastation it could cause. He said that between the forged power of attorney, the recordings, and the terms of the living trust, we had more than enough evidence to destroy Kara legally. She could face criminal charges for forgery and elder financial abuse. She could lose everything she had schemed so hard to obtain. Justice was not just possible, it was virtually guaranteed. But then Douglas leaned forward, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. He reminded me that Kara was not the only one who would suffer if we pursued this path. Noah had signed documents. Noah had remained silent during years of mistreatment. Noah had chosen his wife over his father again and again. If we activated the Elder Protection Clause and pursued criminal charges against Kara, my son would lose his inheritance, his marriage, and quite possibly his freedom if prosecutors decided his silence made him complicit. Douglas looked at me gravely, his hands folded on the desk between us. We have enough to destroy her legally, Leonard, but this will also destroy your son. Are you prepared for that? I drove home from Douglas's office with his question echoing in my mind like a bell that would not stop ringing. Are you prepared for that? The weight of those words pressed down on me as I navigated the familiar streets, passing houses where families were sitting down to lunch, where grandchildren were playing in yards, where life continued in its ordinary rhythms while mine had become something I barely recognized. Was I prepared to destroy my son? The honest answer was that I did not know. I had spent 70 years building things. Bridges, relationships, a family, a life. Destruction was not in my nature, but neither was surrender. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked at the curb. It was a modest sedan, practical and unpretentious, exactly the kind of vehicle Ruth Holloway had always driven. My heart lifted slightly at the sight. Ruth had been Margaret's closest friend for over 40 years, ever since they met at a church fundraiser when they were both young mothers with more dreams than money. They had raised their children together, weathered losses together, and shared secrets that no one else would ever know. If anyone understood what Margaret had been thinking in her final months, it was Ruth. She was waiting on my front porch, a small package in her hands, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. When she saw me step out of the car, her face softened into an expression of such genuine compassion that I nearly broke down right there in the driveway. Ruth had that effect on people. She carried warmth, the way some people carry perfume, leaving a trace of comfort wherever she went. I invited her inside, and we settled into the living room where Margaret's presence still lingered in every photograph and every carefully chosen piece of furniture. Ruth did not waste time with small talk. She told me that she had heard about the dinner from a mutual friend who lived near Noah and Kara. Word travels fast in small communities, and the sight of me leaving their house on a Friday night had not gone unnoticed. She wanted to know if I was all right, and more importantly, she wanted to know what I was planning to do. I told her about Douglas, about the living trust, about the forged power of attorney. I told her about the recordings Margaret had hidden in the old radio. Ruth listened without interruption, nodding slowly, her eyes glistening with something between pride and sorrow. When I finished, she reached across and took my hand in hers. Her grip was firm, despite her age, steady and reassuring. "Leonard," she said softly, "I need you to hear something important. Margaret loved you more than anything in this world. She spent her final months making sure you would be protected. But she never wanted revenge. She wanted justice. There is a difference, and you must understand it before you go any further. Revenge is about making someone suffer. Justice is about making things right. Margaret did not prepare all of this so you could destroy Kara out of anger. She prepared it so you could defend yourself with dignity. Do not let hatred turn you into something she would not recognize." I sat with those words for a long moment, feeling their truth settle into my bones. Ruth was right. Margaret had never been a vengeful woman. She was fierce when she needed to be protective of those she loved, but she had always believed in fairness over fury. If I pursued this path with a heart full of rage, I would be betraying everything she stood for. But if I pursued it with a commitment to truth and justice, I would be honoring her memory in the way she deserved. Ruth seemed to sense the shift in my thinking. She nodded approvingly and then leaned closer, her voice dropping to something more confidential. "There is something else you need to know," she said. "Something Margaret told me years ago that I've never shared with anyone. It is about Kara's family, about where she learned to be the way she is." I straightened in my chair, suddenly alert, sensing that whatever Ruth was about to reveal would change my understanding of everything. "Margaret noticed patterns," Ruth continued. "It was her gift, her training from all those years investigating insurance claims. She could see connections that other people missed. About 5 years ago, she started looking into Kara's background, not out of malice, but out of concern. She wanted to understand who had joined your family. What she discovered troubled her deeply. Kara's mother had been married 3 times before. Each husband was wealthy when she met him, a successful dentist, then a real estate developer, then a retired executive. And each one was broken and poor by the end of the marriage. Bankrupted, isolated from their families, stripped of everything they had built. That woman perfected her methods over decades, and she taught her daughter everything she knew. The revelation hit me like cold water. Kara's behavior was not simply greed or selfishness. It was a learned skill passed down from mother to daughter like a dark inheritance. She had been trained to identify vulnerable targets, to isolate them from support systems, to manipulate legal and financial structures until there was nothing left to take. Margaret had seen this pattern and recognized it for what it was. That was why she had prepared so meticulously. She was not just protecting me from Kara. She was protecting me from an entire system of exploitation that had been refined over generations. Ruth reached into the package she had brought and withdrew a folder. Inside was a handwritten list in Margaret's familiar script, names and dates arranged in neat columns. Margaret compiled this before she passed. Ruth explained, "It is a list of people Kara approached before she met Noah. Men she dated, relationships that ended abruptly, patterns that seemed suspicious. Margaret wanted you to have this if the time ever came when you needed to understand the full scope of what you were dealing with." I took the folder with trembling hands and scanned the names. Most of them meant nothing to me, strangers from towns I had never visited, lives that had intersected with Kara's briefly before she moved on to her next target. But one name near the bottom of the list made my blood run cold. It was a man's name, followed by two words that changed everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law. First husband. I looked up at Ruth. My voice barely a whisper. Kara was married before Noah. Ruth nodded slowly, her expression grave. For 2 years. The marriage ended quietly, sealed records, confidential settlement. Noah never knew. Your family never knew. Margaret only discovered it because she knew where to look and what questions to ask. I stared at the name on the paper, my mind racing with implications I was only beginning to understand. Kara had hidden an entire marriage from us, an entire life. What else had she concealed? What had happened to this man she had married before my son? And most importantly, what had she taken from him before she moved on? The name on that list haunted me through a sleepless night. Kara's first husband. A man who had existed in her life before Noah, before our family, before any of us knew she existed. By morning, I had made a decision. I needed to know everything. I needed to understand exactly who had entered our lives and what she was truly capable of. I called Douglas before breakfast and asked if he could help me investigate. His answer was immediate. He had already started. 2 days later, I sat in Douglas's office surrounded by documents, photographs, and records that painted a picture more disturbing than anything I had imagined. Douglas had spent decades building relationships with attorneys, investigators, and courthouse clerks across New England. When he needed information, he knew exactly where to look and whom to ask. What he had uncovered about Kara's past was not just troubling. It was a blueprint for systematic destruction. Kara's first husband was a man named Richard Townsend. He had been 52 years old when they met, a successful architect who had built a comfortable life through talent and hard work. Kara was 24 at the time, charming and attentive, the kind of young woman who made older men feel vital and appreciated. They married within 8 months of their first meeting. The wedding was small and private, attended only by a handful of friends and Kara's mother. Richard's family was notably absent. His parents, both in their late 70s, had not been invited. The pattern that emerged from Douglas's investigation was sickeningly familiar. Within the first year of marriage, Kara had systematically isolated Richard from everyone who cared about him. She convinced him that his business partners were taking advantage of him, that his friends were jealous of his success, that his elderly parents were becoming a burden on their new life together. One by one, the relationships that had sustained Richard for decades began to wither. His parents, who had once spoken to their son every week, found their calls going unanswered. When they drove to his home to check on him, Kara met them at the door with excuses. Richard was busy. Richard was traveling. Richard did not have time for visitors. Eventually, they stopped coming altogether. Meanwhile, Kara was methodically gaining control of Richard's finances. She suggested they consolidate their accounts for convenience. She offered to handle the household bills so he could focus on his work. She persuaded him to add her name to the deed of his home, the titles of his cars, the ownership documents of his investment accounts. By the end of their second year together, there was not a single asset in Richard's name that Kara did not also control. The divorce came suddenly and without warning. One morning, Richard woke to find Kara gone along with half the contents of their home. The papers she had filed cited irreconcilable differences and demanded an equitable division of marital assets. But equitable in Kara's interpretation meant everything she could legally claim. The settlement took nearly 2 years to finalize, and by the time it was over, Richard Townsend had lost his home, his savings, and his will to fight. He moved to a small apartment in another state and rarely spoke to anyone from his former life. His parents never recovered from the estrangement. His mother died without ever reconciling with her son. I listened to Douglas recount these details with a growing sense of horror. The parallels to my own situation were impossible to ignore. The isolation, the financial manipulation, the dismissal of elderly parents as inconvenient obstacles. Kara had done all of this before, and she had nearly succeeded in doing it again. The only difference was that Margaret had seen her coming, but the investigation did not stop with Kara. Douglas had followed the threads further, tracing the origins of her methods to their source. What he discovered was even more chilling. Kara's mother, a woman named Vivian, had perfected this strategy long before her daughter was old enough to learn it. Vivian had been married 3 times, each marriage lasting between 2 and 4 years, each ending with a substantial financial settlement in her favor. Her first husband had been a dentist who lost his practice during the divorce. Her second had been a real estate developer who declared bankruptcy shortly after their separation. Her third had been a retired corporate executive who spent his final years in a nursing home alone and impoverished while Vivian enjoyed the proceeds of their dissolved union. Douglas slid a yellowed newspaper clipping across the desk toward me. It was from a small regional paper dated 12 years ago and showed 2 women standing on the steps of a courthouse. One was Vivian, her smile triumphant and cold. The other was Kara, younger but unmistakably the same woman who had ordered me out of her home. They stood arm in arm like partners celebrating a successful business deal. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Local women celebrate favorable divorce settlement." I stared at that image for a long time. Mother and daughter united in victory, their expressions revealing nothing of the destruction they had left in their wake. This was not a photograph of family. It was a photograph of predators posing with their kill. Vivian had spent decades refining her techniques, learning from each marriage what worked and what did not, and then she had passed that knowledge to her daughter like a dark inheritance. Kara had been groomed for this life. She had been trained to identify vulnerable targets to gain their trust, to systematically dismantle their support systems until there was nothing left to protect them. And then she had been sent out into the world to continue the family tradition. Douglas gathered the documents and photographs into a neat pile, his expression grave. He told me that he had seen many cases of financial exploitation in his career. Greedy relatives, opportunistic strangers, desperate people making terrible choices. But he had never seen anything quite like this. This was not opportunism. This was methodology. This was a system of predation that had been tested and refined over decades past, from mother to daughter, like a recipe for poison. He looked at me across the desk, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "This is not one bad person, Leonard. This is a family business. They are professional predators, and you were always their target. From the moment Kara met Noah, from the moment she learned about your family and your savings and your comfortable life, you were marked. She did not fall in love with your son. She identified him as her next opportunity. And she has been working toward this moment ever since." I sat in silence, absorbing the full scope of what I was facing. My daughter-in-law was not simply a greedy woman who had made bad choices. She was a trained operative in a multi-generational scheme of exploitation. And my son, my Noah, had been her unwitting accomplice for 8 years. The revelation about Kara and her mother left me feeling as though the ground beneath my feet had turned to sand. I had entered Douglas's office that morning believing I understood the threat I faced. I left understanding that the threat was far greater, far older, and far more calculated than anything I had imagined. But as devastating as that knowledge was, it did not prepare me for what Douglas revealed next. The predators had not been working alone. They had an accomplice inside my own family, and his betrayal cut deeper than anything Kara had ever done. Douglas asked me to sit down before he continued. The gentleness in his voice told me that whatever was coming would be difficult to hear. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a single document, placing it on the table between us with the care of a man handling something fragile and dangerous. I looked at the paper and felt my heart begin to crack. It was a pre-authorization form for residential placement at a facility called Pinewood Manor. The form bore yesterday's date, a description of the facility's services, and a signature at the bottom that I would have recognized anywhere. My son's name written in his own hand authorizing my immediate transfer to a locked memory care unit upon completion of an upcoming family meeting. I read the document 3 times, certain I must be misunderstanding something. Pinewood Manor was not an assisted living community. It was not a retirement residence where seniors enjoyed their golden years surrounded by friends and activities. Douglas explained that he had researched the facility thoroughly. It was a locked ward, a place where patients were confined for their own safety, where doors required codes to open, where residents were not permitted to leave without staff supervision. The kind of place families sent loved ones who could no longer care for themselves, who wandered at night, who had lost their grip on reality. The kind of place no one sent a father who was healthy, lucid, and entirely capable of managing his own affairs. Yet there was my son's signature authorizing exactly that. Douglas walked me through the timeline he had reconstructed. The form had been signed 3 days ago during a meeting at Kara's attorney's office. Noah had been present along with Kara and a representative from Pinewood Manor who had explained the facility's intake procedures. According to the documents Douglas had obtained, the plan was simple and ruthless. A family meeting would be called under the pretense of discussing Margaret's estate. During that meeting, Kara would present evidence that I was showing signs of cognitive decline, confusion, memory loss, and inability to manage my own finances. She would argue that for my own safety and well-being, I needed to be placed in professional care immediately. The Pinewood Manor representative would be standing by to transport me directly from the meeting to the facility where I would be admitted under the pre-authorization Noah had already signed. I would have walked into that meeting expecting a conversation about inheritance. I would have walked out in the back of a van, stripped of my freedom, my home, and my dignity, and my son had made it possible. The pain that washed through me in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced since Margaret's death. This was not the sharp grief of sudden loss or the dull ache of loneliness. This was betrayal in its purest form, delivered by the person I had trusted most completely. I had changed Noah's diapers. I had taught him to ride a bicycle, to drive a car, to shake hands like a man. I had worked double shifts to pay for his college education. I had walked him down the aisle at his wedding, believing I was giving him to a woman who would love him as much as I did. And in return, he had signed a piece of paper that would have imprisoned me in a facility for people who had lost their minds. Douglas gave me time to absorb the shock before he spoke again. He said that Noah's involvement was not surprising, given everything we had learned about Kara's methods. She had spent 8 years conditioning him, breaking down his independence, replacing his judgment with her own. By now, Noah probably could not distinguish between his own thoughts and the ideas Kara had planted in his head. He was not evil. He was controlled. That did not excuse what he had done, but it might explain it. I wanted to believe that explanation. I wanted to find some way to reconcile the son I had raised with the man who had signed away my freedom. So I asked Douglas if I could see the original document, not the copy he had shown me, but the actual form with Noah's actual signature. Douglas hesitated, then retrieved it from his files. I held it up to the light and studied my son's handwriting with the same attention to detail that Margaret had taught me to apply to everything important in life. What I saw made me pause. Noah's signature was not the confident fluid script I had seen on birthday cards and holiday letters for decades. The letters were shaky, uneven, pressed too hard in some places and too light in others. The N that began his name tilted at an awkward angle as if his hand had trembled at the crucial moment. The final letters trailed off weakly, lacking the decisive stroke that usually ended his signature. This was not the handwriting of a man who was certain of what he was doing. This was the handwriting of a man at war with himself, forcing his pen across the page against the resistance of his own conscience. I set the document down and stared at it for a long time. Somewhere inside my son, buried beneath 8 years of Kara's manipulation, there was still a fragment of the boy I had raised. The boy who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on insects. The boy who once gave his lunch money to a classmate whose family could not afford food. The boy who had held my hand at his mother's funeral and promised to always be there for me. That boy was still alive, trapped inside a man who had lost his way, screaming silently against the terrible things he was being asked to do. The shaky signature was proof. Noah had signed that document, but some part of him had resisted. Some part of him knew it was wrong. I looked up at Douglas, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than anger and grief. I felt a tiny flame of hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. My son was not beyond saving. He was lost deeply and perhaps irretrievably lost, but he was not gone. The question was whether I could reach him before Kara's plan reached its conclusion. The question was whether he would choose his father over his wife when the moment of truth arrived. I made my decision in that quiet office, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and glimpses of redemption. I would not protect Noah from the consequences of his choices. He had signed that document. He had participated in a scheme to imprison his own father. He would have to answer for that, whatever form that answer might take. But I would give him one last chance, one final opportunity to remember who he was and who had raised him, one moment to choose between the woman who had corrupted him and the father who had loved him since before he drew his first breath. I would not save him, but I would give him the chance to save himself. The decision to give Noah one last chance settled something inside me that had been churning since the night of that terrible dinner. I was not at peace, not by any measure, but I had found a direction, a purpose. Margaret had given me the tools to defend myself, and now I would use them not just to protect what was mine, but to offer my son a path back to the man he was supposed to become. Whether he would take that path was beyond my control, but offering it was something I could do, something I had to do. Douglas watched me reach this resolution with an expression I could not quite read. When I looked up from the document bearing Noah's trembling signature, I found him studying me with something that resembled admiration mixed with old sorrow. He cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to a framed photograph on his desk that I had never noticed before. It showed a younger Douglas standing outside this very building, a proud smile on his face, a set of keys in his hand. The day he opened his own practice, I realized. The day he became his own man. He asked me if I remembered the winter of 1999. The question seemed to come from nowhere, disconnected from everything we had been discussing. But the way he asked it, quiet and careful, told me this was not a random tangent. I searched my memory and found fragments of that year. A brutal February, record snowfall, the economy stumbling, and Douglas younger then, standing in my living room with his hat in his hands and shame written across his face. I remembered. Douglas had come to me 25 years ago in the depths of the worst crisis of his life. A major client had defaulted on payments totaling nearly $60,000. His landlord was threatening eviction from the office space he had occupied for a decade. His wife had given him an ultimatum: fix this, or she was taking the children to her mother's house. He was a proud man, Douglas, the kind who would rather suffer in silence than admit he needed help. But that winter had broken something in him, and he had come to me because he had nowhere else to turn. I gave him $40,000. I wrote the check without hesitation, without conditions, without any expectation of repayment. He was my friend. He was Margaret's friend. He was a good man drowning in circumstances beyond his control. I told him to pay me back when he could, and if he never could, that was fine too. He had taken the money with tears in his eyes and promised he would make it right someday. I told him to forget about it. I meant it. The money was not alone in my mind. It was simply what one friend did for another when the world turned cruel. Douglas told me he had never forgotten. Not a single day in 25 years had passed without him remembering that check, that conversation, that act of unconditional generosity when he had nothing to offer in return. He had tried to repay me several times over the years, but I had always refused. The money did not matter to me. What mattered was that he had survived, rebuilt his practice, saved his marriage, and become the man sitting across from me now. That was payment enough. But Douglas shook his head slowly, his jaw set with determination. He said that money could always be repaid in dollars, but kindness of that magnitude required something more. It required waiting for the right moment, the moment when the person who had saved you needed saving themselves. He looked at me with fierce clarity and said that this was that moment. This was his chance to repay a debt that had hung over him for a quarter century. He would not let me face this battle alone. He would fight beside me with everything he had, and he would not stop until justice was served. Before I could respond, Douglas reached into his desk and withdrew another folder. His expression darkened as he opened it, revealing documents I had not yet seen. He told me that his investigation had uncovered something more urgent than anything we had discussed so far. Kara was not waiting for the family meeting to make her move. She had already taken action concrete and irreversible that revealed the full scope of her intentions. 3 days ago, Kara had visited Pinewood Manor in person. She had met with the admissions coordinator, toured the locked memory care unit, and completed all the paperwork necessary to secure a bed for a new patient. She had paid a deposit of $5,000 from an account she shared with Noah, money that would be forfeited if the admission did not proceed as scheduled. And she had provided detailed information about the patient she intended to admit: his age, his medical history, his current living situation. She had described symptoms of cognitive decline, confusion, memory lapses, and inability to manage daily tasks without supervision. She had painted a portrait of a man descending into dementia, a man who needed round-the-clock care in a secure facility for his own safety. The man she described was me. I sat in stunned silence as Douglas explained what he had learned. Kara had scheduled my admission for the day after the family meeting. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. She would use the meeting to establish a narrative of my mental decline, pointing to invented incidents and fabricated concerns. She would express tearful worry about my well-being, playing the role of devoted daughter-in-law who only wanted what was best for her aging father. And then, with Noah's pre-signed authorization in hand, she would have me transported directly from that meeting to a locked facility where I would spend the rest of my days surrounded by strangers, stripped of my autonomy, forgotten by the world. I was 70 years old. I was healthy. My mind was sharp. I had no symptoms of dementia, no confusion, no memory problems beyond the ordinary forgetfulness that comes with age. What Kara was planning was not care. It was imprisonment. It was the final stage of a scheme designed to remove me from the picture entirely so she could claim everything Margaret and I had built without interference. But now I knew. I knew the date, the location, the method. I knew exactly when and how they planned to spring their trap, and that knowledge transformed me from prey into something else entirely. The hunter does not fear the trap when he can see its jaws. Douglas asked me if I was ready to take the offensive. I told him I was. He nodded and pulled a sheet of his official letterhead from a drawer. With careful precision, he drafted a formal invitation to all relevant parties. Leonard Ashford. Noah Ashford, Kara Ashford. The subject line read, "Meeting regarding the final wishes of Margaret Ashford." The date was set for 4 days from now, the location Douglas's conference room. The tone was professional, neutral, revealing nothing of what awaited. He printed 3 copies and sealed them in envelopes, one for me, one for Noah, one for Kara. I watched him affix stamps and address labels, knowing that when those letters arrived, they would set in motion a confrontation that would change everything. Across town, Kara retrieved her mail the following afternoon. She sorted through bills and advertisements until her fingers found the envelope bearing Douglas Merritt's return address. She opened it with mild curiosity that quickly transformed into satisfaction. A meeting about Margaret's estate. Finally! She had been waiting for this moment for 18 months. She smiled as she read the details, already calculating how much she would inherit, already planning how she would spend it. She had no idea she was walking into the end of everything she had built. The letters went out the next morning, carried by the postal service, toward destinations that would determine the course of all our lives. I spent the following days in a state of tense anticipation, reviewing documents with Douglas, listening to more of Margaret's recordings, preparing myself for the confrontation that was rapidly approaching. But while I waited and planned, Kara was doing the same. What I learned later about those final days before the meeting came from Noah himself, confessed in fragments over the months that followed. The picture he painted was one of a woman so certain of her victory that she never saw the ground opening beneath her feet. Kara received Douglas's letter on a Tuesday afternoon. She stood in her kitchen, slicing open the envelope with a manicured fingernail, her eyes scanning the formal language with growing excitement. A meeting regarding Margaret's estate. Finally, after 18 months of waiting, the moment she had been working toward was within reach. She called out to Noah, who was sitting in the living room pretending to watch television, and waved the letter triumphantly. "After tomorrow, everything will be ours." Her voice rang with confidence, with certainty, with the absolute conviction of someone who believed she had already won. Noah nodded without enthusiasm, but Kara was too intoxicated by her own anticipation to notice his lack of response. That evening, she presented him with one final document. She had prepared it herself, working from templates she found online, refining the language until it said exactly what she needed it to say. Emergency guardianship papers. The document would grant her complete legal authority over my person and my property effective immediately upon my alleged incapacitation. With this paper signed, she would not need to wait for courts or medical evaluations. She could make decisions about my care, my living situation, my finances without consulting anyone. She could have me committed to Pinewood Manor and strip away everything I owned before I even understood what was happening. She slid the document across the kitchen table toward Noah, a pen resting on top like a period at the end of a sentence. "Sign this," she said. "It is just a precaution in case your father becomes difficult at the meeting." Noah picked up the pen, but his hand did not move toward the signature line. He stared at the document, reading the words that would seal his father's fate, and something inside him hesitated. The pen hovered over the paper, trembling slightly, going nowhere. "Are we sure about this?" The question emerged from his mouth before he could stop it, small and uncertain, the voice of a man who had forgotten how to assert himself, but had not entirely forgotten how to doubt. Kara's expression shifted instantly. The warmth drained from her face, replaced by something cold and hard, the true face beneath the mask she wore for the outside world. Her voice turned to ice. "Sign it. Do not be weak like your father." The words struck Noah like a slap, and for a moment he simply sat there, absorbing the contempt his wife made no effort to hide. Then slowly, mechanically, he signed his name at the bottom of the page. Kara snatched the document away before the ink was dry, satisfied, already moving on to the next phase of her plan. But something had cracked inside Noah that night. Something Kara's words had broken open without her realizing it. "Do not be weak like your father." The phrase echoed in his mind as he lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling while Kara slept peacefully beside him. Weak. She thought I was weak. She thought my father was weak. The man who had built bridges across 3 states, who had raised a family on principles and hard work, who had loved my mother with a devotion that lasted half a century. Weak. The word felt wrong in a way Noah could not articulate, a splinter lodged somewhere deep that would not let him rest. He rose from bed sometime after midnight, careful not to wake Kara, and walked barefoot through the dark house. His feet carried him to the hallway where old photographs hung in frames that had not been dusted in months. He stopped before one image in particular, a wedding photograph he had passed thousands of times without really seeing. His parents on their wedding day, young and radiant with hope. His father stood tall in a borrowed suit, his smile wide and genuine, his eyes bright with the promise of the life ahead. His mother glowed beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her expression one of complete trust and perfect joy. They looked so happy, so innocent, so utterly unprepared for the daughter-in-law who would one day try to destroy everything they had built. Noah stared at that photograph for a long time. He thought about the man his father had been, the man he still was, despite everything Kara had done to diminish him. He thought about his mother, who had loved him unconditionally, who had believed in him, even when he gave her no reason to believe. He thought about the document. He had just signed the document that would imprison his father in a facility for people who had lost their minds. And somewhere in the darkness of that hallway, something stirred inside him. A feeling he had not experienced in years. A feeling Kara had worked systematically to extinguish. Shame, guilt, the faint, desperate recognition that he had become someone his younger self would not recognize. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. He didn't know how to undo the damage he had caused or escape the trap he had helped build. But he knew with a certainty that surprised him that he could not let tomorrow proceed as Kara had planned. He could not watch his father be dragged away to a locked facility while he stood by in silence. He could not be that man, not anymore. I was sitting in my study at 11 o'clock that night, unable to sleep, when my phone rang. The sound startled me in the quiet house, sharp and insistent. I looked at the screen and felt my breath catch in my throat. The caller ID showed a single word, a name I had not seen on my phone in months: Noah. I stared at the phone in my hand, watching Noah's name pulse on the screen with each ring. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. What could he possibly say to me now, after everything that had happened, after everything I had learned about his complicity in Kara's schemes? But something made me answer. Perhaps it was the hour so late that only urgent matters demanded attention. Perhaps it was the memory of that shaky signature, the evidence that some part of my son was still fighting against the man Kara had made him become. Or perhaps it was simply the hope that refuses to die in a father's heart, no matter how many times it has been wounded. I pressed the answer button and raised the phone to my ear. I didn't speak. I waited. The voice that came through the line was barely recognizable. Noah sounded like a man who had been crying, his words thick and unsteady, his breathing ragged with emotion. "Dad," he said, and the single syllable carried more weight than any speech he had ever given. "Dad, I need to tell you something, about tomorrow, about what Kara is planning." I remained silent, letting him continue. The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam, rushing and tumbling over each other in his urgency to confess. He told me about Pinewood Manor, about the locked memory care unit where Kara intended to imprison me. He told me about the pre-authorization form he had signed, the document that would allow them to commit me without my consent. He told me about the emergency guardianship papers, the final piece of Kara's puzzle designed to give her complete control over my life and my assets. He told me about the plan to use tomorrow's meeting as the staging ground for my destruction, to paint me as a confused old man who could no longer care for himself, to have me transported directly from Douglas's office to a facility where I would spend my remaining years forgotten and alone. His voice broke repeatedly as he spoke, cracking under the weight of his own guilt. He told me he was sorry. He told me he had not understood what he was doing, that Kara had convinced him it was for my own good, that he had believed her lies because believing them was easier than facing the truth. He told me he had been a coward, a fool, a terrible son. He told me he didn't expect forgiveness, but that he could not let tomorrow happen without warning me first. When he finally fell silent, exhausted by his own confession, I let the quiet stretch between us for a long moment. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for my response, bracing himself for the anger and condemnation he surely expected. But when I spoke, my voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. "I know, son. I have known for months." The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost feel Noah's shock traveling through the phone, the disbelief that rendered him momentarily speechless. When he found his voice again, it was small and bewildered. "You knew? How could you possibly know?" I told him about his mother. I told him that Margaret had seen what Kara was from the very beginning, had recognized the predator beneath the charming smile, had understood the danger long before any of the rest of us. I told him about the letter she had left for me, the instructions to contact Douglas, the living trust she had created with its elder protection clause. I told him about the recordings hidden in the old radio, the evidence she had gathered over years of careful observation. I told him that his mother had loved him too much to destroy his marriage while she was alive, but she had loved me too much to leave me unprotected after she was gone. "Your mother knew before she died," I said. "She prepared for this. She prepared for everything." Noah's composure shattered completely. Through the phone, I heard the sound of a grown man weeping deep, racking sobs that spoke of years of suppressed guilt finally breaking free. He apologized again and again, the words tumbling out between gasps for air, a litany of regret that seemed to have no end. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. I should have stood up to her. I should have been the son you raised me to be." I listened to his tears with a heart that felt both broken and strangely whole. This was my boy, the child I had held in my arms on the day he was born, the young man I had watched grow into an adult, the son I had never stopped loving despite everything that had happened between us. His pain was genuine. His remorse was real. And yet I could not pretend that a single phone call erased 8 years of silence, 8 years of watching his wife tear me apart piece by piece while he did nothing. "Sorry does not undo 8 years of silence," I said quietly. "Sorry does not give me back the holidays I spent alone, the birthdays that went unacknowledged, the countless moments when you chose her comfort over my dignity. Sorry is just a word, Noah. It is what comes after the word that matters." He fell silent again, chastened by the truth of what I had said. But I was not finished. I told him that despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain and the documents he had signed against me, his phone call tonight meant something. It meant that somewhere inside him, buried beneath years of Kara's influence, the son I had raised still existed. It meant that he had found the courage, however late, to choose truth over convenience. It meant that there was still hope, however fragile, for the relationship we had lost. But hope was not the same as redemption. Redemption had to be earned. "Tomorrow you will have to choose," I said. "The meeting will happen, the truth will come out, and when it does, you will have to decide where you stand, with truth or with her. I cannot make that choice for you, son. Only you can." I heard him draw a shaky breath, absorbing the weight of what I was asking. Then very quietly he said he understood. I told him I would see him tomorrow, and I hung up the phone. I did not sleep that night. I sat in Margaret's chair in the study, surrounded by her books and her photographs, and the faint lingering scent of the lavender she had loved, and I waited for morning. The hours passed slowly, each minute, stretching toward the confrontation that would determine the course of all our lives. When dawn finally broke through the curtains, I rose, showered, dressed in my best suit, and drove to Douglas's office with a calm I had not expected to feel. Whatever happened today, I was ready. Margaret had made sure of that. Douglas's conference room had been arranged with careful attention to detail. A long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs positioned to face each other across its polished surface. Douglas sat at the head of the table, a thick folder resting before him, his expression neutral and professional. Ruth had arrived early and taken a seat near the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes carrying the weight of everything she knew but could not say. I sat across from her, my back straight, my gaze steady, and waiting for the others to arrive. Noah entered first. He looked like a man who had not slept in days, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and dread. He glanced at me briefly, a look loaded with uncertainty and unspoken apology, then took his seat at the middle of the table. His leg began bouncing immediately, a nervous rhythm that betrayed the turmoil beneath his composed exterior. He did not speak. He did not need to. Everything he was feeling was written plainly on his face. Then Kara arrived, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. She swept through the door like a woman attending a celebration rather than a legal proceeding. Her designer dress was immaculate, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood the power of appearance. She smiled warmly as she entered, her eyes moving around the room with practiced ease, taking in each face as if greeting old friends at a party. When her gaze landed on me, her smile widened into something that might have passed for genuine affection if I had not known what lay beneath it. Dad. She said, her voice dripping with sweetness. I'm so sorry about that dinner. I was under so much stress and I said things I did not mean. You know how much I love this family. You know how much I love you. The words hung in the air like perfume masking something rotten. I said nothing. Douglas said nothing. Ruth watched Kara with an expression I had seen only once before on the face of a nurse tending to a patient who did not know their diagnosis was terminal. It was sorrowful pity, the look of someone watching another person walk confidently toward a cliff they could not see. Kara took her seat beside Noah, reaching over to squeeze his hand in a gesture of unity. He flinched slightly at her touch but did not pull away. She continued talking, filling the silence with words designed to establish her narrative before anyone else could speak. She mentioned how worried she had been about my health, how she and Noah had discussed ways to ensure I was properly cared for, how this meeting was really a blessing because it gave everyone a chance to come together as a family and make decisions that honored Margaret's memory. Douglas listened without interruption, his pen moving occasionally across a legal pad, his face revealing nothing. He let Kara speak for nearly 5 minutes, let her build her castle of lies brick by careful brick, let her believe that her performance was achieving its intended effect. When she finally paused to take a breath, satisfied that she had set the stage to her advantage, Douglas looked up from his notes with an expression of professional neutrality. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Mrs. Ashford, he said calmly. I appreciate your perspective. Kara smiled, interpreting his politeness as validation. She settled back in her chair with the confidence of someone who believed the hardest part was over. Douglas reached for the thick folder that had been resting before him throughout her monologue. He opened it slowly, deliberately, and cleared his throat. Now he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced every other sound in the room. Let me read what Margaret Ashford actually left behind. Douglas began with the living trust, reading the key provisions in a measured voice that filled every corner of the room. He explained how Margaret had created this document 3 years before her death, working in secret with legal counsel, to construct a framework that would protect her husband long after she was gone. He described the primary beneficiary status that guaranteed my control over all assets for the remainder of my life. He outlined the conditions under which Noah could inherit conditions that required demonstrated respect and care for his father. And then he reached the provision that made Kara's confident smile falter for the first time. The Elder Protection Clause, Douglas read, authorizes the trustee to redirect all assets to the Margaret Ashford Foundation in the event of documented verbal abuse, financial exploitation, or any attempt to deprive Leonard Ashford of his autonomy or dignity. He looked up from the document and met Kara's eyes. "Mrs. Ashford, I have in my possession substantial documentation of exactly such behavior." He reached into the folder and withdrew the first exhibit, a copy of the power of attorney that Kara had presented 3 months ago, the document she believed had given her control over my finances. Beside it, Douglas placed a report from a certified handwriting analyst complete with enlarged comparisons and professional annotations. "This signature," Douglas explained, "is not Leonard Ashford's. The analyst's conclusion is unequivocal. This document is a forgery which constitutes a felony under Vermont law." Kara's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but Douglas was already moving to the second exhibit. He produced a small recording device and pressed play. The room filled with Kara's own voice, captured without her knowledge in my home-speaking words she never imagined anyone would hear. "Your father is worth more dead than alive to us. The sooner he is out of the picture, the sooner we can take control of everything." The recording lasted only 30 seconds, but its impact was devastating. Kara stared at the device as if it were a serpent that had suddenly appeared on the table before her. Douglas did not pause for her reaction. He moved to the third exhibit, a collection of documents from Pinewood Manor. Receipts showing a $5,000 deposit paid from Noah and Kara's joint account. Intake forms describing a patient with advanced dementia who required immediate placement in a locked memory care unit. Medical claims that bore no resemblance to my actual health status. This facility, Douglas said, was prepared to admit Leonard Ashford against his will based on fraudulent claims of cognitive impairment. The admission was scheduled for tomorrow. The color had drained entirely from Kara's face, now replaced by a sickly gray that aged her 10 years in seconds. But Douglas was not finished. He withdrew the final exhibit, a collection of records that Ruth had helped compile from Margaret's research. Documentation of Kara's first marriage, sealed divorce proceedings, settlement records, evidence of her mother's 3 marriages, each ending with a wealthy husband reduced to poverty. Newspaper clippings showing mother and daughter celebrating outside courthouses, their faces bright with triumph. This pattern of predatory behavior, Douglas concluded, spanning 2 generations and multiple victims, constitutes exactly the kind of exploitation the Elder Protection Clause was designed to address. Under the terms of this trust, with the documented evidence I have presented, all assets will transfer immediately to the Margaret Ashford Foundation. Noah and Kara Ashford are permanently disqualified from any inheritance. For a moment the room was completely still. Then Kara exploded. She slammed both hands on the table with a force that rattled the water glasses. Her face had transformed from pale to crimson. Her carefully composed features twisted into something ugly and desperate. "You cannot do this," she screamed. "This is my family. I have given 8 years to this family. You cannot take everything from me. I will not let you. I will sue. I will fight. I will destroy every single one of you." Her head whipped toward Noah, who sat frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with shock. "Say something," she demanded, her voice rising to a shriek. "Tell them I am your wife. Tell them you love me. Defend me, Noah. Do something." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to my son. Ruth watched with quiet compassion. Douglas waited with professional patience. I held my breath, remembering our conversation from the night before, remembering the choice I had told him he would have to make. Slowly, deliberately, Noah rose from his chair. Noah stood motionless, caught between 2 worlds. To his left sat Kara, her face contorted with rage and desperation, her eyes blazing with the fury of a woman watching her carefully constructed empire crumble. To his right sat his father, the man who had raised him, loved him, and never stopped believing that somewhere inside the stranger he had become, the real Noah still existed. 8 years of cowardice pressed down on his shoulders. 8 years of silence, of complicity, of choosing the easy path over the right one. And now, in this single moment, he had to decide who he truly was. Kara hissed at him through clenched teeth. "Noah, sit down. We will fight this together. We will get lawyers. We will appeal. Just sit down and stand by your wife." Noah looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since the day they met. He saw the coldness beneath the beauty, the calculation behind every smile, the predator who had targeted his family and systematically dismantled everything his parents had built. He saw the woman who had taught him to abandon his father, to sign documents that would have imprisoned an innocent man to become someone his younger self would have despised. Then he looked at me. He saw the father who had never stopped loving him despite everything. The father who had given him one last chance to make things right. He took a breath. and he walked around the table slowly, deliberately, until he stood beside my chair. "I am done, Kara." He spoke the words quietly, but they carried the weight of a man finally finding his voice. "I should have done this years ago. I should have protected my father instead of helping you destroy him." He turned to me, his eyes glistening with tears. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry," Kara screamed. The sound that tore from her throat was not human, not rational, not anything I had ever heard before. She lunged across the table toward the documents Douglas had presented, fingers clawing at the evidence of her crimes. Douglas moved the folder away calmly, professionally, as if he had anticipated this exact reaction. Ruth rose from her chair and stepped back, watching with quiet sorrow as the woman who had caused so much pain finally revealed her true nature to everyone in the room. Douglas waited until Kara's fury exhausted itself, until she collapsed back into her chair, breathing heavily, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Then he spoke in the same measured tone he had used throughout the proceedings. "Mrs. Ashford, all evidence presented today will be forwarded to law enforcement. You face charges of forgery and elder financial abuse which carry penalties of up to 5 years in prison. Additionally, your mother is now under investigation. Previous victims have been contacted and are cooperating with authorities." Kara stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without sound, the full scope of her destruction finally becoming clear. I rose from my chair and looked at her one final time. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no joy in her downfall. I felt only the quiet peace of a man who had defended himself with dignity and truth. "I did not need to destroy you, Kara. You did that yourself." I took Noah's arm and together we walked out of that conference room. Ruth followed quietly behind us, her hand briefly touching my shoulder as we passed through the door. Behind us, Kara remained alone at the table, surrounded by the ruins of everything she had schemed to possess. Her empire collapsed, her future shattered by her own choices. 6 months passed. Spring arrived with gentle warmth, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxing green shoots from the frozen ground. In those months, much had changed. Kara received 3 years probation, mandatory restitution, and a permanent restraining order that prohibited her from contacting me or Noah ever again. Her mother faced multiple civil suits from victims who had finally found the courage to come forward. The pattern of predation that had spanned 2 generations was finally being exposed to the light. Noah filed for divorce the week after the meeting. The process was painful but necessary. A surgical removal of the poison that had infected his life for nearly a decade. He moved into a small apartment across town and began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding himself. We met for coffee every Saturday morning, conversations that started awkward and gradually grew easier. He was not the son I remembered, not yet, but he was becoming someone new, someone who had learned from his failures and was determined to do better. That was enough. That was more than enough. I used the assets Margaret and I had accumulated to establish the Margaret Ashford Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting elderly victims of family financial abuse. We provided legal resources, counseling services, and education programs designed to help vulnerable seniors recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Margaret had spent her final months protecting me. Now her legacy would protect countless others. Ruth visited often. Our friendship, forged in the fires of crisis, had become a source of quiet joy in my daily life. We took walks together, shared meals, talked about Margaret and the memories we both cherished. She helped me understand that moving forward did not mean forgetting the past. It meant honoring it while making room for whatever came next. On a bright spring morning, I drove to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. The grass had turned green again, and wildflowers dotted the hillside with splashes of color. I knelt before her headstone and placed a bouquet of fresh white lilies against the granite, her favorite flowers, the ones I had given her on every anniversary for nearly 50 years. "You protected me even after you were gone," I said softly. "You knew I would not fight back on my own, so you gave me the tools and the courage. You saw what was coming before anyone else, and you made sure I would survive it." I touched the headstone gently, feeling the cool stone beneath my fingers, imagining her warmth still somehow present in this quiet place. That night when Kara told me to leave, I thought I had lost everything. My son, my family, my dignity. But I was wrong. I straightened my coat and rose to my feet. The morning sun warmed my face, and somewhere in the distance, birds sang their welcome to the new season. I smiled peaceful and whole, ready for whatever remained of my life. I didn't leave alone. I left with your love, your wisdom, and my dignity. And that was more than enough. And that brings us to the end of Leonard's story. What strikes me most about this journey is not the revenge itself, but the love that made it possible. Margaret saw the danger years before anyone else, and instead of confronting it directly, she quietly built a fortress around the man she loved. That is what true partnership looks like. It is not just about the good times. It is about protecting each other even when you cannot be there to do it yourself. Now, if you find yourself in a situation like Leonard's, here is my advice. First, document everything. Keep records of conversations, save text messages, write down dates and details. You never know when those small pieces of evidence will become your greatest protection. Second, do not be afraid to seek legal counsel. A good attorney can help you understand your rights and create safeguards before problems escalate. Third, and this is perhaps the most important, do not let anyone isolate you from the people who care about you. Predators thrive on isolation. They want you alone, confused, and dependent. Stay connected to friends, to community, to anyone who sees your worth. And finally, remember that standing up for yourself is not the same as seeking revenge. Leonard did not destroy Kara out of hatred. He simply refused to be destroyed by her. There is dignity in that. There is strength in that. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to Revenge Room for more stories of justice, dignity, and the quiet power of people who refuse to be broken. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.